I hit it. Yeah, we
Awesome.
are live. Hey.
Well, good to see you again, Peter.
Nice to see you. Nice to see myself. Thank you.
Yes, it's good to see you on the screen.
Nice to be seen.
Yeah,
man. So you're out of town next week, so that's why we have to do it this week. Yes. Hey, we're keeping it every 2 weeks, so we're on the.
We're trying.
We're doing well.
And then, so I'm out of town next week, and then you're out of town the week after that.
Yeah.
So
I'm hanging out with Sean Morris. You know Sean Morris?
Oh, sweet. I do know Sean.
We're going to be drinking Oban whiskey and smoking pipes and
wow,
talking theology. I'm really looking forward to hanging out with him. So
I'm absolutely
Sean,
jealous.
if you're watching this, looking forward to it, man. Yeah,
I plan on doing some of that this next week. So
nice. Yes.
I don't know, folks, if I'll have.
We are whiskey drinkers. I hope all of the people that listen will still listen to us, even though we're whiskey drinkers. That is true. Not too much. I like whiskey because you really can't drink it that much. You have to stop after like 2. It's not like gin.
Oh yeah.
You could keep going gin. That's why I stay away from it. So whiskey is like, you have to drink it slow.
I can't drink gin sipping wise. I have a gin and tonic, but just a shot of bourbon is good. That'll last me the night. So
all right. So
enough about that.
Yeah, we're talking about queer theory today, which I actually think is this is going to be a place where I think a lot of our viewers, a lot of our listeners are going to see how it's definitely applied all throughout our culture, especially as we're talking about the Equality Act and what that's going to do. I think this chapter was extremely informative on where this philosophy is, where it came from, what it's trying to do. It was kind of eye-opening reading it for a second time, especially parts where they're actually not really, they say explicitly that they're not concerned about truth. They're not concerned about biology. They're not concerned about science, but they are concerned about turning this into queering, which is a social construction. And they actually say this over and over again. And I didn't have to make this up. That's actually they would like to do this so that it's a lot easier to be an advocate, because if it's a social construction, if gender is a social construction, then advocacy work is a lot easier. But we'll jump right. Yeah, we could jump in and just talk to our listeners what queer theory is. And I don't mind defining it really quick.
Okay.
Yeah. So queer theory is just really about the liberation from what is normal, especially when we look at binaries. And what queer theory is trying to do is, when it looks at gender and sexuality, they want to make a distinction between these two things. And it really sees or regards the very existence of categories, any type of categories of sex, any categories of gender, sexuality are oppressive for them. And queer theory, because it derives directly from postmodernism, it is really skeptical of any time I put something in a binary term. So categorizing you and I as males, for example, they're going to want to, they're fine with us categorizing ourselves that way, but we need to ask permission. This is why what's changing on a lot of college campuses, why we should never assume that somebody who looks like a quote man is a man, because we don't know how they categorize themselves. Queer theory does ignore biology nearly completely. In fact, it doesn't like when people bring in biology in the discussion, because they feel like biology, which it does, puts things in species, it puts things in male and female categories, it puts roles on these things. And it does little to encourage accessibility with most people. And in fact, it can be very difficult to plow through and really try to understand. But it really presumes that oppression follows from categorization. And that's whether you're reading from Judith Butler, Sedgwick, whatnot. If you're categorizing, you're going to oppress. So I don't know if you wanted to add anything there. Yeah.
Well, I think you're right on the idea. They open up the chapter with their goal is really to blur the categories, blur and confuse the boundaries of sexual identity, because it can it's a means of sort of I guess pushing back on or reflecting upon the power of language. and recognizing that so this takes us back to the whole applied postmodernism. And this is taking some of Michel Foucault's postmodern theories and applying them into a social justice construct in terms of sexuality. So they focus on recognizing that language creates categories, enforces them, and then scripts people into them. And the blurring of boundaries, the boundaries are arbitrary, oppressive, and can be erased by blurring them into apparent absurdity. So really that's the goal, right? They want to blur the boundaries so that they are viewed as absurd and unhelpful. And then we can get rid of sort of this theory of normativity. Anyways, so I think you're right. They do talk about the binary thinking really being false thinking and wanting to. It's really what the idea of queering comes from, right? To just get rid of that binary thinking across the board in every sphere.
Yeah, and also the other thing too that they would also say that rigid categories will lead to not just oppression but possible violence, and scripting people into them. When you're scripting somebody into a category that maybe they're uncomfortable with, they would call that violence, which is one of the reasons why, say, for example, even in the Equality Act or schools, you often hear a lot of LGBTQ advocates say this is a form of violence. If you were to mispronounce somebody's name, it should be seen as a hate crime, those types of things. This is really where a lot of this is coming from. I would also say too that queer theory also makes the use of these to satisfy its ultimate purpose, which is to identify and make visible the ways in which the linguistic existence of these categories create oppression and disrupt them. So just reading right there. So they constantly want to they just want to disrupt all categories as much as they can so that we can blur the boundaries can be blurred. And we could see that these are oppressive, and therefore they want to lead us into some type of actual absurdity. Absurdity for queer theory is actually good.
Right.
Chaos is good for queer theorists. It's good that we talk about incoherence, illogic, talk about intelligibility, things that are incomprehensible. That is actually where they would like you to go. I think you brought up this a few weeks ago, how Judith Butler, one of the authors, I think she won 2 or 3 times the worst sentence in of the year, or something like that, worst written sentence. I'm sure she kind of boasted about that, but yeah.
Yeah, that was a genuine award for them.
Yeah. Good for you.
We were successful, even though it was kind of a mocking award. Yeah. But anyway, I think what I did find this a little bit fascinating or interesting, just they point out the brief history of queer theory, and they connect the idea of Christianity and Greek culture both being really opposing views on homosexuality, recognizing that in Christian history, male homosexuality has been considered a heinous sin, and we'll talk maybe later on in this episode a little bit about how that's being blurred now within the boundaries of within the church. But you have also the Greek culture viewing homosexuality as acceptable for a man to have sex with an adolescent boy until they reach an age where they would marry, and then they would have sex with women. So that being an acceptable practice, and yet both. Why they point that history out is to compare the two and say that they viewed homosexuality as an act. It was a deed that was done, not an identity that someone, that defined everything about a person. So they specifically say this in both cases. However, homosexuality was something that people did rather than who they were. I think that's pretty important, because once we start to acknowledge, once we suggest that our sexuality is what defines us, then you really are turning that into a religion, right? You're turning your sexuality into the thing you worship, and there's just no place for that. There's no compatibility between that and Christianity. So
Yeah, no, and also too, I think the history has exploded because our understanding of sex and gender has, our understanding of sex and gender has actually not changed. Although we may regard homosexuality the last century and a half, we've made a lot of changes about how we view homosexuality, but our understanding of sex and gender actually has changed much less, according to the book. And we've always so gender roles though have changed considerably. I think that's the main point, and I think that's what the public sphere and the mind and the body. Where people used to say that the man represented the mind and women represented the body. That those attitudes have quite changed quite a bit. So sex is to gender as man is to manly or woman as womanly, for example. I mean, just with that sentence, the idea of that gender seems to have always been with us. In other words, sex is to, we've always kind of made this distinction between sex and gender in some way, the gender roles, but we never completely separated the two. And, so I think the history has really kind of gone off on trying to examine those roles and then to make the equivocation that because these roles are different and they can be different, therefore it must also apply that sex can also be fluid as well. Right now we've seen a lot of gender roles change quite a bit. Women are actually in the workforce. Women are allowed to vote. Women are doing things that they couldn't have done even 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So that is just kind of, changed a lot of people's assumption that, well, that must then therefore mean that if gender roles are so fluid, is sex also somehow fluid, since the two seem to be in power with one another, or in relationship with one another.
Yeah, and they're in that denial of the binaries, the denial of the categories. They even are denying biological, scientific categories. And that comes from, again, Michel Foucault. And on page 93, they talk about the concept of biopower, which is the power of scientific discourses. And so they're again, pushing back on that, wanting to redefine what we mean by sex and gender roles. So queer theorists, it says, believe that sex, gender, and sexuality are social constructs. So therefore they depend upon the prevailing culture, and they're less concerned about material progress than about dominant discourses or about how dominant discourses erect and enforce categories like male, feminine, and gay. So I thought that was, that's important to see that they're not so much concerned. You just pointed that out, right? We've made progress. We're seeing less injustice toward women, and yet that's not really the concern. It's what are the discourses that we're telling and we're teaching, because that's all they want to critique.
Well, not to jump ahead, but that's exactly when we start critiquing critical race theorists. People like Jamar Tisby, Kendi. They will refuse to acknowledge, or very, very often they won't acknowledge any type of progress. Right. So theorists are very suspicious of progress, which is one of the differences that they have with classical liberals like Steven Pinker, for example. So Steven Pinker is a classical liberal. He's often very critical of theorists like queer theorists and critical race theorists because they're of their suspicion of progress. And but the queer, I should say this too, just as to queer, what does that mean? To queer is really it really refers to anything that falls outside binaries. So there's the noun and then there's the verb, that's where they like to make that distinction, that the noun queer, the person who is queer, is outside the binary of male and female. I remember having a person that, I remember I was in a training once, and there was a person that was a queer individual, and he didn't really have, or she, whatever, didn't really go by any pronouns. You could say he, you could say she. They didn't really mind at all. Okay. But queer theory, though, is very much a political project. And this is my, I was really my jaw dropped a little bit when I read this again, that queer theory's political agenda is to challenge what is called normativity, that some things are more common or regular to the human condition. And so the verb to queer is to try to get out or try to point out all the normative categories that are in our society, and to identify things like hetero or cis or thin, for example, of somebody who's not obese. And the reason for that, when you're using it as a verb, is because you want to start casting doubt on these quote stable structures, and to disrupt fixed categories and really offer any type of skeptical view of anyone that wants to put things into binaries. And that's what queering really is. It's about unmasking any sense of the normal. And so I did. So there's they're going to resist categories and distrust language. Go ahead.
Yeah, we keep saying the same thing. It is a it's a bit of a redundant idea, right? Because it comes down to, let's get rid of categories. We want to what queer theory is about, liberating people from the category that they've been placed in. And so if you want to accept a category or something like that, well, then I guess the idea is try to disassociate yourself from that category. Eventually they talk about the fact that there are that really it's a spectrum, not a binary, right? So if you're on a spectrum, then we're all a little bit gay. We might be more so than others, and some of us might be more accepting of that idea than others. But the idea is that we're all a little bit there. And if we explored a boundaryless, we got rid of our boundaries, we would be able to, I guess, enjoy and appreciate that all the more, which is the concern I have. And I'm just going to throw this out there real quick, but not say much about it because I haven't thought through it. But that's the concern a lot of people have with side B Christianity, which is this idea that you can be a homosexual Christian, and as long as you're not acting on those desires, or you're not acting upon the identity as a homosexual, then you're still honoring the Lord. You're still being a faithful Christian, a follower of Christ. And it sort of removes this idea of there being that sin begins in the heart, and there's a lust that is already contrary to God's will for your life. And so I think side B Christianity blurs that, much like queer theory has taught us to do. So anyways, that we may have another time to talk about that. I didn't want to go too off topic from the chapter of the book, but I just, in terms of my own pastoral ministry, that's a subject that.
What's that called again? What's it called? Side B or
side B Christianity?
Oh, side B.
Side A would be the typical.
Oh, like a cassette tape, side A and side B.
Yeah, right.
All right, yes. Okay.
So you can still be a Christian, but you're holding to a different view of homosexuality, and trying to limit the extent that, or to suggest that you can actually even celebrate your identity as a homosexual as long as you're not acting upon those desires. Like your goal as a homosexual Christian would be to honor God in your abstaining from sexual sin.
I will say though, what's interesting though about homosexuality, it relates, but it doesn't, because there are people who are gay who are also very against queer theory. People like Dave Rubin, for example. Dave Rubin is a gay man. In fact, I would even say older people who are gay, who identify as gay, like around the 1960s and 70s, are a little skeptical of some of where the things, where Judith Butler goes, because she does want to get rid of all categories, and many males who are gay are actually, quote, proud gay men, especially with lesbians. A lot of lesbians are actually they don't identify as queer theorists. They are proud for being a lesbian, so there's actually a lot of, and I like to bring that up because a lot of people assume that LGBTQ, they all agree on the exact same things.
They're all united.
And that's one of the ways the left really will cudgel people in the middle, or moderates, or even liberals, or even classical liberals, or people on the right, because they are constantly saying, well, you are you're homophobic, and they use that. They use the fallacy of equivocation, putting all LGBT people in one giant category, when really I think if you can kind of break up huge amounts of disagreements in those categories, then you could already kind of say that, queer theory is very different from, these types of disagreements, even amongst other gays and lesbians, for example. Yeah.
No, that's a good point. There's obviously they're not unified in their approach as much as it's presented.
Because one thing that the book brings up in 96 is that, very few people are strict biological essentialists anymore. And those who are shown to be wrong by scientists, and everyone nearly accepts that some combination, though, a few in biology and culture comes together to create expressions of sex, gender, and sexuality. In other words, you just can't ignore the biological influence of, nature versus nurture, basically. And that's what that sentence is saying, is anyone who is too dogmatic on nature versus nurture or nurture versus nature is committing a biological error. Now, queer theorists would strongly disagree with that. They're radically social constructivists. And that's why when we interviewed Dr. What was the guy that came on a few podcasts ago?
I can't remember the name.
Oh, shoot. Yeah. The doctor that we interviewed a few podcasts ago. This is the problem doing things live.
A while ago.
A little while ago. But he said that there's not one scientific paper out there that has proven that gender and sex are two different things, because queer theorists they're not using the scientific method. They're not using biology to prove their points. They're social constructivists. And so science is actually not welcome because, again, science is all about categories. Categories are therefore violent. And so biologists and psychologists even are often advancing knowledge of how the sexes differ. I teach a lot of psychology. I'm constantly talking about male aggression, female aggression, how they're interrelated, how they're different, all of those things. A queer theorist will go in my class and say that I'm, providing way too many categories and I'm being violent in some way. And that really comes through Michel Foucault's, I don't want to repeat myself, but his power knowledge. But one of the things I really liked about this chapter, though, is that I wanted to,
I looked up that name. It's Dr. Jeffrey Barrows.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. But I wanted to, because I'd love to get your, power knowledge is what we have just talked about. Power is everywhere. Right. This is the first chapter that really talks about woke, that this is where it kind of introduces it, because being woke, is being able to see that everything around us is embraced by these power structures, is present on all levels of society. Yep. And that power works like this for Foucault, not because it has the privilege of consolidating everything under its invincible unity, but because it's produced from one mount to the next. So that kind of that univocal power is normal. And then once you see that, you're actually woken up to that problematic. And that's very true when we start getting to the race stuff. When you say to somebody, racism's everywhere, all around us, every single, even in the water we drink, it comes from the same type of category, not category, but, the same theory.
Same postmodern theory, philosophy. So Foucault called it the omnipresence of power, which that helps clarify, right, what is underlying so much of the assumptions of Black Lives Matter and queer theorists and all the other topics that we'll possibly get to. I don't know. I kind of want to talk about obviously critical race theory and intersectionality, and then but it goes on into feminist studies and fat studies and disability studies. And anyways, I don't know how much of that I have the energy to to have even a 30-minute conversation about. I mean, I do want to talk about obviously these bigger issues. And so the omnipresence of power, I like how they put it here on page 98. They say the view has gone on to become one of the core beliefs, this view, right? This idea of power being everywhere. It's a core belief of applied postmodernism and social justice activism today. Unjust power is everywhere, always, and it manifests in biases that are largely invisible because they've been internalized as normal. And that's why so many people, we've just internalized it as normal, so we can't see it as clearly. We need to be awakened. We need to be woke to this reality. And anyone who doesn't acknowledge it is just asleep still. Right? I mean, it's instead of addressing it, like what you and I have done oftentimes, at least in what I've seen on Facebook, is sort of like, okay, what's the evidence? Where's the empirical data for the suggestion that this was racially motivated? That this, I mean, we need to understand that there's some evidence supporting the claims, but this just assumes those. It assumes it based upon what we view as normal. And again, that does take us all the way back to the beginning of the book, the idea of postmodernism just being this narrative, whatever the main meta narrative is, it's that way because of oppression. And the only way to get rid of it is to constantly push against that narrative. And the narrative is assumed to be true. It's never questioned or challenged with evidence. Supported with evidence. When you get into the evidence, then you start reading guys like Thomas Sowell and you go, it doesn't suggest what we've been, what they're saying. There's a lot of other factors that we need to consider. So,
well, and that's a great point. I mean, and that's why, in page 99, Rubin, who is, Gail Rubin, state that that we should believe sex, gender, and sexuality to be social constructs, not because it's necessarily true,
right,
but because it's easier to politicize and demand change if they're social constructs than if they're biological. So,
wow.
I mean, that.
So there's no debate. No, there's nothing to debate.
Yeah,
nothing to prove.
Well, and that goes back to earlier. So. Judith Butler talks a lot about this as well, but the ought needs to go before is for postmodernism. So ought, and so in Aristotelian Greek thought, as well as Platonic thought, you often had an epistemology. When you think about the nature of ethics, you think about systematic theology, right? Bavinck, right? The nature, where do they start? The nature of God, the epistemology, all of these things. And then at the very end, Bavinck's last, systematic is ethics. And that was the common way of thinking about, okay, what is? Because if I can't do if I don't know who I am. And, that, think about that, like how can you do if you don't know who you are? Where with this, it's you should do, and doing is the definition of who you are. So,
right.
So with Butler, gender is performativity. So it's gender is not by definition, but how you create gender. So it wouldn't matter, say, for example, if you took on a female role, because you doing that defines that you are a female in that moment. So that's why it's so fluid for her. Yeah. So that's what she means by gender performativity. Yeah. That's what
I was just going to point that out. That's that you're defining gender performativity, that's what defines who we are. And Butler then leads into they transition. They stick with Butler for quite a bit, talking about compulsory, taking the concept of, let's see, it's page 103. Butler theorizes this by using the Derridian notion of I don't even know how to pronounce this. Phallogocentrism. Geocentrism.
Yes, yeah.
The idea that social reality.
Phallogocentrism. Yes.
The idea that social reality is constructed by language that privileges the masculine. And so by expanding on Adrian Rich's concept of compulsory heterosexuality, wherein heterosexuality is taken as the natural state of being, and homosexuality is therefore scripted as a perversion to enforce compliance with doing straightness. And then obviously, so this theory relies upon, views of Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci, and leads to some language that I don't want to share that Butler calls gender effing.
Basically.
The conscious effort to subvert traditional notions of gender identity and gender roles. So just obliterating the categories of roles.
Well, and the
So
other thing too that a lot of people don't know, and this, I'm glad we're talking about this, because I think a lot of Christians, when they get on these tangents, they don't really know where a lot of these things come from. One of the things that they are doing, a lot of the queer theorists, they have a profound moral relativism about sexuality. So they want to include a defense of basically pedophilia.
Right.
A lot of people don't know that. Call His Name, which is a movie that came out a few years ago, won like a few Academy Awards. That it's a man who falls in love with a 17-year-old boy. There's a group called, I believe, Lambda. And it actually it wants to justify homosexual men, particularly, to have relationships with younger men. A lot of people don't know that, and it would make sense here too, because the radical constructivism, and as they focus on these discourses, they want to liberate sexuality to any types of categories of judgment, to include that. And so gender performativity is, to jump ahead over there, is, again, the ought should go first. There is no is. And that would make sense, because the minute I describe these categories as right or wrong, I'm already going to the is in the very beginning. I'm oppressive. So many people don't realize that these politics of parity and, that basically to call out and subvert every kind of pattern of gender performance, they want to destroy all of that, and lead towards some type of advocacy toward, to complete incoherence, in other words.
Right.
And I don't think, so there's the very, very little redeeming qualities about this,
Yeah. Right.
I didn't know if
I
you
agree.
wanted to say
Well,
I
I wanted to say one more thing, but I like how they close on actually two more things. So one is this idea of they define they make a distinction between universalizing view or the more minoritizing view and the universalizing view. And the minoritizing view is that homosexuals are seen as those in the minority. They're the minority group, and therefore the majority is heterosexual. So they want to get rid of that kind of thinking and replace it with universalizing view, which is, I alluded to this earlier, but it's the view that considers sexuality as a spectrum in which everybody has a place on that spectrum. And so we're all a little bit of everything, and we might lean one way or the other. And in fact, it's a bit of a fluid spectrum. So you can go wherever you want, whenever you want, which obviously is just a recipe for emotional and intellectual disaster for someone. It's going to lead to some psychological concerns if you're constantly redefining who you are and based upon your identity that's fluid, right? There's nothing stable in your mind or in your practices based on that, which obviously it would be, I think, the goal when it comes to queer theorists. But man, it's gonna wreck some lives along the way.
And maybe we should end on the gospel. Let's tell our listeners about that. In the beginning, God created male and female, and He said that these were good. And so one of the beautiful things about that is that God is not insulted by categories. God also, through the chaos, through tohu and bohu, the Hebrew, He creates out of chaos, and He creates goodness. That we weren't meant for chaos. There's a loss of our humanity. I was just talking to a friend over at CrossFit. Thank you, babe. Today had to come up, and he was just talking about how the chaos, when you're constantly moving the goalposts over and over and over again. Now you're vaccinated, but you still have to wear a mask, and how psychologically it's been so damaging for him and for me. We're both sharing. It was for me as well. That it's exhausting because we can only handle so much chaos. And gosh, I hope they fire Fauci one of these days. My goodness, boot him out, please. The guy's awful for our country. He was good for like 5 minutes, but anyway, sorry to get all political, but I just going back on that, we brought up like, that we were meant, God created he created male and female, and he created them as good. And what this is really about is just a new form of Gnosticism, that everything is really mystical. Everything is unknown. Jesus is not really a man. Jesus was a mystical spirit. This is not the gospel. This is anti-gospel. You're going to go to hell if you believe this. If I could be bold, you really are, because it's not the Christ of the Bible. You can't believe queer theory and be a Christian. You can't, because you believe in a false Jesus, because Jesus came as a man, and Jesus's humanity was good. And it says in 1 John that if you deny the flesh of Christ, you are part of the Antichrist. And I'm going to be bold here, because I'm just quoting scripture. So this is so antithetical to the beauty of the word and the beauty of how God made us. You cannot combine this theory with a faith that is in line with the teachings of scripture. You have to see that God created man and women good by design. And not only that, but he, through the redemption of through the birth and the life and the death of Jesus Christ as a man, we are now saved. We now have a new humanity that is good as well. And that God loves categories and that God is not a God of confusion. He is a God of order. And that is love. So that is love, not this. So that's the thing, because they claim the rainbow, they claim this is loving, not loving. Love is through the gospel. Love is through the humanity of Christ. That's love. And don't be tricked by this stuff.
Yeah, that's good, Peter. I mean, you're dead on. And obviously he didn't just create us good as male and female, but he created us in such a way that we need one another in order to perpetuate and to fulfill the great, the creation mandate to multiply and fill the earth. And that's part of what this whole queer theory tries to disrupt and eliminate. But you literally cannot avoid it. You cannot say that a man can have a baby. It just, it's not biologically possible. And so you're denying God's created order. You're denying the roles that he also attaches to the gender that you have, or to the sex that you have. Right. And anyway, so, and then he Paul makes the very clear connection between all of that and within the context of marriage as a picture of the gospel. So you're absolutely right. This is an attack upon the gospel. It's an attack upon what we know to be true based upon God's revelation, that God has given us one another and our genders and our roles within marriage in order to honor him and to reflect God's love for us. And so that therefore I need to be a sacrificial leader of my home and a spiritual leader. And I also, my wife is called to be a submissive helper to that. And that's not a derogatory language. It's not that she needs to be my slave or something. That's language that's applied to God.
Yeah. As a it even says you to submit to her in the Bible too. So submit to one another.
There's mutual submission.
But I know what you mean. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and also, I mean, yeah, and if I could just lead, and I know we're, but I mean, also with common grace too. There's the gospel. What about common grace? I would just encourage our listeners too. Any theory that says that we're not concerned about truth, we're only concerned about advocacy, that's not common grace. Common grace, the reason why we've had people on the podcast who are not believers. They've given a lot of beautiful wisdom because their primary concern is truth. I do believe that through the area of common grace, you can learn a lot through our unbelieving neighbors and friends, because if that's Greg is truly about, I don't know where he stands, but he's truly about seeking truth. And that's why we love having him on. We have other people have come on too. That's their primary concern. And so we invite that as well, but we have to draw the line when you're just one, preaching a Gnostic philosophy, and two, you're not even concerned about truth. You even stated it. You're only concerned about completely disrupting, complete disorder, creating chaos. Yep. And I don't see.
All right.
Anyway.
Yeah. I think you're right. And even James Lindsay, I've heard him talk. I don't know if it was with Helen as well, Helen Pluckrose, the authors of Cynical Theories, but he was talking about the idea that I actually feel like I have more in common with Christians whom I disagree with. He's an atheist, right? And we're reflecting upon a book by atheist authors, but they
That's true.
Why we're doing this is because we are combined. We both agree that there is an objective reality that cannot be ignored. And what postmodern theory does is it obliterates truth, the category of truth or objective reality. Anyways, so good stuff, Peter. We gotta both
cut out.
We'll end on that.
And on 40, we're almost there. All right. That's all right.
Really good.
That's good. Thanks everyone for listening. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.